Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Welcome back. It's another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. This is Jessa, and I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for taking the time, the interest to tune in, to download, to listen. I appreciate it. If you have not heard, I have a new resource available for people on demand, a webinar training I did called How to Make Sex Easy for both of you, instead of making it feel like an obligation. So I'm trying to address the common struggles couples have where sex gets stressful or anxiety provoking or difficult, or it starts to be, the thing that isn't really working in the rest of your life together. And I don't want that. I want to help you improve that. So you've got access. If you go to intimacywithease.com/training, you can get instant access to that webinar, and hopefully that will get you far along on your path to creating an easily intimate relationship with your partner. Today's episode is a little bit of an outlier for me. I say that a lot, but this one's new. I'm talking to Richelle Fribotta, who is a sexuality educator. I mean, she teaches college sex ed. She's taught through Planned Parenthood. She teaches independently and through her own business, but really has a heart for sex ed for the developmentally and intellectually disabled population. And as she talks about in this interview, for a lot of times there's even a conversation about why do these people need this? Why do they need this information? As if they are not sexual beings, but humans are. And it's really, really important. And there are things to consider, and there are challenges, and there are things you got to think about differently. But sex ed matters for everybody. So it's a great conversation. And the odds that somebody in this population are probably kind of slim, but it's still a really interesting talk in general about the importance of sex ed, what is important to know and to teach and to discuss, how do families open up these conversations, DD or not, the issues are really kind of the same. I hope you enjoy it. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. So, Richelle, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. I'm glad to meet you and glad to be here and sharing ideas about sexuality.
Yeah. So maybe start with, give a little perspective to the listeners around the history or the topic of sexuality education in a developmentally disabled population or people with those challenges.
Sure. Happy to. I mean, we can look at the larger history of sexuality education, and we know that people of religious ideology were the first sex educators. And so there are strong roots in dogma, in faith, in ways that people are supposed to behave, and then the constructs that go along with making that behavior happen. And so if we take that large idea and we narrow it down to people with disabilities, or in my case, I work mostly with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we know that their place in the larger society was not.
Right.
There's a horrible history around people who are different, in particular intellectually or physically different. And so if we take that and we narrow it even more, then not being able to meet somebody of the opposite sex, date a while, get engaged or fall in love, get married, have sex on the honeymoon and make babies, it's not a life course probability for many people, a majority of people, right, with developmental disabilities.
Yeah.
So I think if we kind of start from that macro and we get down to the present day, what we see is we could only improve with regard to information about human sexuality, making it accessible and available to people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So it's just kind of marginalized groups always kind of, I think, suffer the lack of vision that the majority or the dominant groups have. And clearly this population of folk is no different, especially when it comes to such a human thing as personal sexual expression and or feelings, erotic feelings.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think of all the, maybe I'd say marginalized groups, but all the ways we don't think of, the elderly. We don't need to think about sex in the elderly or the disabled or, right. It's like people are sexual across their lifespan, all people, right? I mean, that this is, it just gets ignored.
Agreed. I mean, I think for us, it's a no-brainer. I think for people who don't accept or understand the humanness that is sexuality, with all its mandated constructs, legislation, and proper ways of being, I think we're kind of at an advantage in the sense that when we look at how so many people are marginalized, and yet this is an across-the-board conversation, no matter identity or intersectionality, or positionality, right? That we really have a large group of people that, once they get pissed off, we're good to go here.
Right.
And that's what I love about my work, whether I'm with a population of developmental disabilities or folks who provide supports to them, or whether I'm with my 20-year-olds at Miami University, just teaching a 300-level sex ed course. People get really angry that they weren't afforded the opportunity to learn such basic information about being a person alive today. So, so we can certainly talk about the marginalized, but there does seem to be a lot in common with regard to not having human sexuality education.
So is there any organized effort to bring this education to this population, or is it just like you're out there by yourself trying to make this, like individuals are doing this, or is there any sort of organized or more governmental approach to this?
Oh, I love your question. So I'm in the field 28 years. And if you had asked my mother, the former Sister of Notre Dame, if she was going to have a kid grow up and teach sex, the answer would have been, oh, hell to the no.
Yeah.
But then being influenced by someone who was a progressive educator, my mom taught special ed. She taught special ed before it was a thing. She was one of the first special ed teachers in the state of Ohio in the 70s. And I wasn't learning disabled, but feel like I became LD by default with all the practice and the testing and the understanding of what is this and how to deliver information to. And so having said that, I can recall, in my early part of my career, no one that I knew in sexuality, either locally and or spread it out with my newly formed contacts with people in sexuality education nationally. I didn't know anybody who was doing this work. And by default, I became the alphabet soup lady. So in my job at Planned Parenthood, I've really not reached out for many gigs in my life. They come to me, and at Planned Parenthood in the 90s, that was no exception. And all of a sudden, an LD teacher would call, or somebody from developmental disabilities support community would say, hey, look, we're seeing this problem. And so two things, I think, in response to your question. One is, I don't think that it was a field per se that I understood or knew about, and I felt very alone and isolated. But today, in definitely more contemporary times, when we have things like technology that kind of covers the distance, which we know now, especially with COVID, that there is a burgeoning community. I know of curricula. Winifred Kempton and Dave Hinsberger are great names of folks historically, decades long into doing sexuality ed work with people with developmental disabilities. And now I can give you probably 10 other names.
Wow.
And so many of the colleagues I'm thinking of are ASECT, either members and or are certified. So I say it's still a burgeoning field.
Mm-hmm.
I say people get really confused still based on our first conversation about why do people with developmental disabilities need to have this information. And I feel like so much of our work in this field is about, again, kind of just that opening the door to understanding about what it is we do. But definitely more curricula today than 10 years ago. More really proactive. I think what my colleagues and I are trying to do, and I'm certainly not speaking for them, but, we're kind of tired of that, why do people with developmental disabilities have a right or want or need access to this information? And I'm all the way like 5 steps down. So I think that's what we're trying to do is get that initial conversation over so we can get to the work of what is primary in sexuality ed for DD today.
Yeah. Are you going to school districts and through teachers and or institutions, or are you trying to reach actual parents and family members? Like what's the venue for this?
Right. Well, I love the term consultant, which means that if you call me and offer money, I'll probably come. To where you are and do the work. So I have, my side gig, so to speak, is just when calls come in, I address them and word gets out. And so I would say at this point, most of my work is through county boards of developmental disabilities. Historically, those were my customers or still are my customers. And what I'm seeing today is a little bit of a shift. I'm now working with 2 residential support providers, which is weird. And I love it. But residential support providers don't, their tasks are so different. There's daily needs of providing services and supports with people with developmental disabilities, which has a different tone to it than, say, support services administrator or an SSA in a county board system who's looking at maybe more of a meso and a macro picture of that person's life, right? So the state, Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities we've been talking and getting some really cool work ideas out there. And I actually, 2 of my newest kind of venues are working with staff in developmental centers. In Ohio, we still have 8 developmental centers, and unfortunately, they'll probably always be necessary. And having said that, I just wrapped up training in the month of June for about 20 staff in those, providing services in those venues. And then I think probably, Jessa, the most exciting work lately, about 3 years ago, I started working with a group of self-advocates in Oklahoma. And I have to say, this is bringing me much joy, much renewed energy. Because again, those gatekeeper conversations are so old, right? I don't want to tell you about why somebody needs this.
Right.
Right. But this working with self-advocates definitely is lighting me up in really interesting ways, pushing my understanding, my idea of partnership. We're co-authoring, we're co-training, and I just love this.
So when you say self-advocates, you mean people that are part of this community are reaching out and taking some leadership role around the topic? Okay.
That's exactly what I mean. Each field has its own jargon, right? Its own vernacular. And so self-advocates in this context, I mean, we could all be considered self-advocates in one way or another, right?
Right.
But in this particular context, it is a term used in the DD community to identify somebody who has these abilities as based on a diagnosis and or whatever supports are identified as needed and or wanted. Yeah, the Oklahoma Self-Advocates Network, OCSAN, is a crew of people who decided that, why wouldn't you listen to my voice? I'm the one experiencing, right? And exactly, yeah. So it is a very particular term in this case.
Yeah. So if there's somebody listening who's got a family member, a child, or a loved one with a developmental disability, and they're not
in an institution, or maybe it doesn't even matter where they're living, are there curricula that they can access to bring into their family? Or is this available on sort of an individual family level?
Interestingly enough, I would say probably when we're talking about families, and this is the thing that I bring to talking about sexuality and people with developmental disabilities, is that we can just take the DD out of it for a second.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about families, it's like parents aren't exactly sure how to do that, right?
Right.
I'm generalizing, of course, but this is why we have AMAZE out of Advocates for Youth, and this is why we have the Future of Sex Ed teaching standards, so that we can say, no, really, parents, folks who are providing caregiving and that sort of connective supports to young people and or adults with developmental disabilities, first we really need you to take this on. And then I think the second thing is, how do you do it? And for me as a teacher, it's a matter of praxis, right? It's a matter of breaking down a concept and delivering it in a way that my students can relate to it for particular outcomes that I think for me in teaching from a comprehensive sexuality ed model, some of these outcomes are universal, right? But then some of them are just very much more specific. For example, when I receive a call from, say, a support services person in a county board, and they're saying that this individual with developmental disabilities is having this problem or this bad behavior, my goal with sexuality ed isn't to correct a problem. Mine is more of a prevention orientation. And I think just understanding some basic human, like how many holes do women have down there? And I use the word down there just in fun for talking, right? We know the words, but that's such a basic concept. If you can grow up and know that, then you can associate with other really basic human concepts. And so, sorry, I got lost again in the answer. I really want to support parents and caregivers in doing this work. Yeah. And I don't think curricula is the way to go. Okay. I think, parents grab onto what they can as they need it.
Right.
And I think, for example, like I mentioned, the AMAZE videos are good. A long time ago, you remember the TV show Roseanne?
Yes.
And if you may remember, they had a lesbian episode. It was shocking. I want to say it was the 90s. And I got a call from a very conservative, religiously conservative radio station at a religiously conservative university. And I'm like, first of all, why are you calling me? This makes no sense. And second, they wanted to interview me on air live to talk about the lesbian episode of Roseanne. And here's what I said. And they were like, well, don't you think this is horrific? Don't you think families should, I don't know, I'm making up words now, but rise up against this? And my response is no, families should watch the stupid TV show with every kid in their household and sit down and talk about it.
Right.
And that's just it. I think parents and caregivers need to be open to talking, probably more importantly, open to listening. I want to work with parents on being askable before I want them to pick up a sex ed curriculum.
Yeah.
Is this making sense? It was such a long answer, Jessica.
No, absolutely. And so much of the stuff, doesn't you take the DD out of it, right? It's the same issues for parents and kids all the time.
Yeah. And of course, there are some unique things when we talk about marginalized communities or particular abilities. Yeah. So there is this more specific conversation there that does need to be addressed. But yeah, I really wish parents and caregivers would do their job.
Right. So I want to get to those specifics in a second, but I also was wondering if there's anything else you want to say about sort of misconceptions, besides the idea that these people don't need this. They somehow are not sexual or something like that's obviously the big one. But are there other misconceptions that you'd want to address?
Well, I do think I think we have this idea of what somebody with an IQ under 70 can and can't do. And so maybe for some people, it's not the material, the sexuality material, but it's how to teach it, or that it can't be taught because it's too abstract, or some folks are just convinced that people with IQs under 70 are not sexual, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I think there are folks who are convinced that if you have a conversation about a penis, then this person is going to want to go and find one. And that would be horrible. I mean, that's the second thought that comes from that.
Right.
So I do think that we continue, historically, we've marginalized this population based on perceptions of what different abilities can and can't do. But then we really just need to get over that.
Yeah.
It's just time.
Right.
Hey, it's Jessa. I'm just taking a little break to invite you to my free monthly webinars that I do on a variety of topics that always include an open Q&A session with me at the end. I'm doing these monthly. If you want to hear about them, be invited so you can register. Make sure you join my mailing list. You can go to bettersexpodcast.com/list.
So talk a little bit about the specific differences and challenges or maybe even outcomes that you aim for if you're working with this population.
Sure. Well, my macro outcomes are always about, I remind people I'm not their mom, I'm not their girlfriend. It's not my job to tell them how they should think, feel, or believe. It really isn't. I have a few hardcore, nonstop kind of, this is how I'm going to come across with these three things. And those are legally related, right? So, it's not okay to not have consent when you're being sexual with somebody. It's not okay if there's a large age difference, especially if that age difference is a minor, or if that person is not a person. And we're talking about animals.
Right.
So my hard stops are fine.
Right. Yeah.
And well known,
Yeah.
and supported by many. And yet there's a large space between, what someone might think is healthy versus what I assess as healthy. So when I teach, I want my students, no matter, to figure out what is working for them, what doesn't work for them. My large goals are always about increasing communication skills so that a yes is an informed yes and a no is an informed no. Or even specifically, and I'm large to small in my idea here, but even how to say no. If you are a person whose whole life has been controlled or run by other people who seem to know better or more than you, or at least that's what you've been told, how do you find that voice that says, I don't want that? And then I think my third large goal is always about prevention, and another way to say that is health and well-being. And so many folks in the developmental disabilities community, women or vagina owners, don't get pap smears, or that assumptions are made that periods, menstruation is going to be just too complex of a task to handle, or it's just messy and gross, and I guess I get really frustrated about folks doing what has been historically done in the idea of cutting off one's ability to menstruate through, say, Depo-Provera use. So my large goals and my small goals tend to inform, but mostly I want that individual who's learning to feel good about what they're learning, to understand where they stop and start with it. Those personal values are essential, not my values, their values. And then, hopefully to use all this information for good. And good for me is healthy and proactive, and, testicular self-exams should happen. And I think how we get there is probably the biggest part of my conversation. First of all, we don't get there by using the word hygiene. Nobody uses the word hygiene. Why are we still using the word hygiene with folks with developmental disabilities, right? Yeah. And secondly, I think praxis is the key. I think how we teach is that's the approach I've always taken. So when I work with staff at a developmental center who want to work with their residents in a more proactive way, they don't need me to teach how to talk with a person who has a developmental disability, that's what they already know how to do.
They already do that all day, right? Yeah.
Right. And that's really my point, is when people are like, but I don't know how to do this. I'm like, yeah, you do. You do it every day. What you don't have is the understanding of human sexuality, which I'm happy to teach you.
Yeah.
Or you may not recognize, you may know that perhaps somebody with a developmental disability needs repetition, but maybe you're not exactly sure how to repeat this message over and over again in different ways so that you say the same thing, but it can be heard perhaps in this manner better than it can in this manner. To me, that's praxis, that's teaching methods. So that's, if I had to outline one big difference, I think teaching methods are what I prefer to teach folks who want to deliver sexuality information to people with developmental disabilities.
Yeah. Is there anything you leave out of the conversation with this population? Or maybe it's more about what's the hierarchy, the stuff you think, oh, this is the baseline that everybody sort of needs, and then we might go to this or we might go to that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I tell you one I've never thought of before. So I had two instant responses. One is we don't leave anything out.
Yeah.
And of course, I say of course, but folks who do sexuality ed will probably already recognize that everything should be age, developmentally appropriate. I hate that word, but that, we at any given time, if we're teaching a 12-year-old, they could look like they're 20 and just have had a tantrum like they're 3, and maybe communicate in a way that says, wow, you are a middle-aged person with the advancement of ideas that you have right now. And so we recognize in any given body, there's so many learning ages that happen. I think the key is figuring out how to best deliver to the age that's right there in front of you. And in DD circumstances, that will probably be a developmental age as opposed to a chronological age. Mm-hmm. But then I'm going to come back and correct myself by saying, if we have a 24-year-old man who developmentally is maybe around 9, 10 years old, but in this 24-year-old body, then we have to be right there delivering that information as well. Mm-hmm. The second thought I had when you were asking that question, I hadn't quite ever considered before, is I also tend to teach where the learners are. So I may walk in, and again, I think I can do this after 28 years of this work, but I can walk in with a lesson plan and try to teach 2 things in 45 minutes out of that lesson plan, and then throw the lesson plan out when a learner says, hey, what about this? So I think teaching to where students are is key in many ways, but one is being able to pivot or turn on a dime and recognize that what's happening in that learning community right then is more important than the lesson plan I walked in with.
Yeah. I guess part of what I was thinking with the question is, it's been a long time since I've been in my own sex ed, and I don't know that much about what my kids had, but it seems to me that often there's a beginning of what's happening with our bodies, and menstruation and arousal, or wet dreams, or whatever it is. And then often sex ed is not going to get to pleasure or communication or how do you navigate this in a relationship with somebody else. Like, maybe that's happening, but it seemed like maybe there'd be the same kind of steps working with the DD population.
So I hear you. Thank you for making that more concrete for me. I'm still going to go to my second answer, and I'm going to teach where they are. And second, I can't, in any given lesson plan, even if it's something on anatomy that may be much more straightforward and concrete or black and white-ish, than say something on decision making, right? Right. I'm going to infuse pleasure in all of that.
Yeah.
Let me just say, I don't care what we're talking about, but the message is going to be, if it feels good and it doesn't violate those 3 hard stops, then it's pleasure. So I'm hearing you, and I'm trying to tease out an answer. And I think first of all, I'm going to ask my customer, right? What's your goal? And and as I already mentioned, oftentimes in the DD field, historically, folks say this person needs to learn about this so you can stop that bad behavior.
Yeah.
Or keep them out of jail, or they're hurting somebody or themselves. And so probably the initial is, why are we hanging out, would prioritize my agenda with what I teach. But secondarily, I am probably going to tackle those communication skills in every lesson plan. It's just going to be infused. It's just going to have to work. Again, when talking about praxis, my stuff doesn't tend to be lecture format. We're going to use multisensory, multiple intelligences approaches to working information in that learning community. And then we're just going to tease out what's working and where students want to go. Yeah. And then maybe I start the next class back where we left off and try to get back on that track again.
Yeah. What it seems to me is it's not useful to sort of have this distinction between anatomy and function and then pleasure and relationship, in any population, right? Like it's such an important part of the conversation. It's probably another misconception that somehow people that are developmentally disabled they're not going to interact with anybody else. Maybe they need to know about masturbation or something, but it seems like no, they're going to need to know decision-making and communication skills with another person. And consent.
Circumstances might play into that. So if I'm working with somebody who's residing in a developmental center, they don't get necessarily to mix with the larger community, right? So I may narrow down and be very concrete about this room in this building on this campus.
Yeah.
So, conversations about public and private can be greatly influenced if you're in a jail cell or not, right?
Yeah.
So there are these nuances that creep in, but and by the way, masturbation, I call self-pleasuring. So like I said, I'm going to sneak it all in where I can.
Right.
But, it's fascinating. I have a curriculum I wrote, 2007-ish. And it was for a county board of DD, actually for 9 county boards of DD in Ohio. And I was really trying to answer your question concretely in my head. And I have 3 sections, and they ebb and flow from basic info to how to use that basic info to, so I tend to pull the sex parts out, because conversation number 1, where we started, right? If I walk in talking about, fantastic pleasure-based anal penetration with folks in this population, I got no work. And not that I'm trying to make work. I'm just simply saying.
Right.
But that 3rd section in that curriculum was all about how do you have a relationship online? Because for some folks in the DD community, that's where their relationships are going to be. And what do we talk about when we're looking at a screen, or if you're watching adult erotica, what does pleasure look like that way? So I tried to, I think there's a tiered approach, but we need to talk about sex even more.
Right. Right.
And that's the thing I get to probably last. I don't say probably, it's the thing I don't get to go to first.
Yeah.
And that, again, sorry to be so general with this, but that's every population. That's my 20-year-olds at my university.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's like that was baked into the sex ed I remember having in high school or middle school, and I think for my kids too. I mean, I always ask them, what are they learning? But I don't hear that much about it. So, yeah.
Has it changed in the times that you've been asking what they're learning?
No, the only thing I think, which I specifically ask, are they talking about other gender identities and sexual orientation? Because that was absent in my, I'm 57. So it was a long time ago that I had sex ed in school. And I remember none of that. And they do talk about it, at least here, around Seattle, it's more inclusive, at least on those fronts. But other than that, I'm not hearing too much that's changed.
No, you bring up a really good point. So I'm 53 and I have 14 years of Catholic education. No.
Yeah.
No, I still remember my job at Planned Parenthood in 1992, and I didn't know the word vulva at all. And I didn't know the word uterus because it was a womb. Yeah. And so that came from my K through 12. And let's just really be honest, there was no K through 8. It was 9th grade once and the football coach. Yeah. So yeah. It's challenging, isn't it? I mean, we have these expectations, but we don't provide the path for folks meeting those expectations.
Right. So where can people learn a little bit more about you and what you do if they wanted to look you up after this conversation?
Oh, how nice. So my LLC is SOSEX, Southern Ohio Sexuality Education Consultation Services. And I believe I'm sosex.com. And they will find the basics. They will find me talking about philosophy and pedagogy, praxis, and availability if they want to connect. And in particular, like I mentioned earlier, I'm just so super excited about working with self-advocates, and whether it's my colleagues and we get to and have conversations about how to do that better, or self-advocates who want to figure out how to get that started. A lot of my energy is going to that work right now. Super excited about it.
Great. Well, thank you again for taking the time.
Sure. Jessa, thanks a lot. I appreciate this conversation.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.